A single braid cut, a nation's anger unleashed. In Raqqa, a soldier's act of humiliation sparks a wave of resistance. Women braiding their hair in defiance from Kurdistan to Europe. What was meant to shame has become a symbol. And for Kurdish women, dignity is not something that can be cut. A video from the Syrian city of Raqqa has triggered an unusual wave of solidarity across Kurdish communities as women began braiding their hair in protest against what they describe as an act of humiliation. The clip shows a Syrian Arab army soldier holding a severed braid, claiming he cut it from a woman affiliated with the Syrian Democratic Forces. When asked why he did it, the man replies that she has already gone.
While global attention has been focused on the Islamic Republic of Iran in recent weeks, a brutal massacre has been ongoing, primarily in northern Syria. And among the bravest and strongest Kurdish warriors, the women. Today, in the state of Tel Aviv and beyond, we focus on the existential fight and plight of Middle Eastern Kurds, longtime allies of the West, who must not be forgotten. Approximately 2.5 million ethnic Kurds live in Syria. There are 20 million in Turkey, 12 million more or less in Iran, and 6.5 million in Iraq. You must understand who the Kurds are and why they are so important to our future, not just in this troubled region, but globally. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. You can now see on the screen a map of the Middle Eastern countries which were just mentioned. And highlighted are the areas in which Kurds are concentrated. There is another map of northern Syria on the screen now, which shows you where the battles between Syrian military forces and the Kurds have been concentrated. Both of these maps will be in the notes to the podcast. Recall that in December 2024, former al-Qaeda senior commander Abu Muhammad al-Julani, as he was then known, led a coalition of jihadists to overthrow President Assad of Syria. It was a lightning-quick operation, and the next day, metaphorically, Julani trimmed his beard, exchanged his combat fatigues for a finely tailored suit, and dropped his nom de guerre, Julani, and he became President Ahmed al Sharaa. The tensions between ethnic Kurds and other tribes in Syria is long-standing and came to a head in early January 2026. The world has been very distracted by Iran, and it was an opportune time for Syria and Turkey to squeeze the Kurds, to pressure them. And what ensued was a horrific assault on Kurdish civilians. It began on January 6th, and it went on unabated for 2 weeks until a very wobbly ceasefire kicked in. Whole families were slaughtered, villages burned, women raped and taken as sex slaves. A horror show that repeats too frequently in this region. Today, we bring you an in-depth report on the crisis with the Kurds through the testimony of several experts who work closely with Kurds in Syria and bring deep knowledge, experience, and commitment to their urgent mission. And that is to tell the world about the slaughter of the Syrian Kurds and urge the Americans to modify what is widely considered to be their betrayal of the Kurds in recent weeks. It is because of the Kurdish forces that ISIS was defeated in Syria. How quickly we forget. Turkey's President Recep Erdogan, also an Islamist, has long pursued an agenda of assimilating Kurds by force. Turkish military forces supported the Syrian army in the recent slaughter of Syrian Kurds. So the Kurds were absolutely stunned when the American ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack, posted a very long statement last week on X. You can read the full post in the podcast notes, and I urge you to do so. But in effect, America is telling the Kurds to fold, lay down arms. I'm making this podcast available in full to all subscribers. Too little is known about the Kurds, and I urge you to listen, share, and be their voice. I would also ask that those of you who are not yet premium subscribers of State of Tel Aviv and Beyond, please consider becoming one today. As a small, independent media outlet, we need your support to continue doing this work. If you value our content, show us the love. You can subscribe on our site, stateoftelaviv.com, or make a contribution to Buy Me a Coffee. All the information is in the podcast notes. We begin our in-depth look at the plight of the Kurds in Syria with American-British physician and activist, Dr. Kanta Ahmed. If she looks familiar, it's because she is. Kanta is a regular guest on international media outlets. Tuesday, January 20th, just before 11 p.m. in Israel, which makes it about 4 p.m. in the afternoon where you are, Dr. Kanta Ahmed. Thank you so much for making time to speak with State of Tel Aviv today about this very, very important development.
Vivian, I'm grateful for the chance. And yes, today is a momentous day. It has been a disastrous day for any of us that were friends and allies of the Kurdish people, any of us that hoped for a better future for Syria. And as Israel is the Jewish state and is very, very aware how much the Kurdish people have stood alongside Israel for years, if not decades, today is a particular disgrace. I received and I have been following the onslaught of atrocities since January 6th, when there was a very strategic assault led by several units under the command of Ahmed al Sharaa, the president of Syria. Those units were commanded by former HTS extremists who very systematically surrounded areas in Aleppo that were known Kurdish neighborhoods. Not only did they surround those areas, they emptied the neighborhoods around them to create a closed military zone. They sealed off Aleppo, which has apparently 8 or so arterial roads, leaving only one open. And then once they were situated, they opened fire with the help of Turkish aerial drones and massive ordnance, more than 80 military heavy armored vehicles with shrapnel and artillery on this civilian unarmed population. That has been going on now for, I guess today is the 14th day. That has resulted, and that was home for 500,000, mostly Yazidi and Kurdish people. That has resulted in the displacement of 200,000. When I last checked, 300,000 were still besieged, but that could have changed. Those numbers were a few days ago. Many of the Yazidis that are in that area have fled towards Afrin, which is also Turkish controlled. They're in rural areas, in villages. They're surrounded by Islamist extremists. And once that was achieved without objection of the international community, Ahmed al Sharaa's troops were given orders and pursued on the highway further eastward towards the centers of power of the Syrian Democratic Forces in the Al-Hasaka province and near Qamishli. And nobody has raised an objection for this. And what's happened there in that area towards the Kurdish heartland and the nerve center of the security of northern Syria is that ISIS prisons, and there are many holding a total of 10,000 ISIS extremists, have been sprung open deliberately by al-Sharaa's forces. There are some civilians reporting to me that they've seen Turkish drones striking on the prison in Raqqa. I don't know if they were drones striking or if they were Turkish aerial surveillance drones providing data. And finally, today, in a ghastly development, the Syrian Democratic Forces finding itself besieged, trying to contain these prisons and secure Al-Hol, has been overrun by the Syrian armed forces and had to relinquish control of the Al-Hol camp. I've been traveling to that region of Iraq with the Kurdish region since 2018, but in 2025, I was on my way to meet General Mazloum Abdi in a very detailed conversation. In fact, what we're seeing today is everything that we feared that could develop. But on the way, I asked to see the Al-Hol camp, which is home to the ISIS families, their children, the so-called ISIS cubs. At its peak in the 2019-2020 period, it had as many as 70,000, 75,000 residents. Many of them have been repatriated, most to Iraq. That's where they came from, but over 40 to 50 different nationalities. But there was still a population of 25,000 women and many children. When I visited there, it was a highly secure area, extremely dangerous, even with armed security to go inside there. I was not allowed to meet and talk to any of the ISIS extremist families, but I saw them through, the window of my vehicles in an armored convoy. I met with the camp directors. So now that entire camp is in the thrall and in the control of Ahmed al Sharaa's forces. So what we have is the US policy sanctioning the total betrayal of the Syrian Democratic Forces, who sacrificed 11,000 soldiers in the war against ISIS, 33,000 wounded at a very minimum. And apparently, US policy now is to give Turkey carte blanche for its dreams of erasure of the Kurds, not only from its border, which is its paranoid excuse, but across the whole of northeast Syria. I've just finished an interview on television in Erbil in Iraq, and they explained to me both the president of Syria and the president of Iraq have spoken about the importance of border security between their countries and a unified Syria. Unified by whom? It seems unified by the definition of a Salafist, Islamist president who clearly has openly extremist ISIS commanders and soldiers.
This, of course, we're speaking of al Sharaa, but al Sharaa and al Sharaa's forces are not friends of the Kurds, to put it mildly.
First of all, let's remember who the Syrian Democratic Forces are. These are an amalgam, mostly of Kurdish troops. They have an entire battalion of female Kurdish troops, just like Israel has female IDF commanders and units, even the female Paran Brigade tank commanders that I've met. They have an entire female unit called the YPG, the Women's Protections Unit, many of whom rescued Yazidi women that were imperiled in the Al-Hol camp, among other things. Not only were they Kurdish troops, they have Christians in their ranks, Yazidis, secular Arabs, other minorities. After the atrocities that you witnessed across the border in southwest Syria, in Suaidia, against the Druze, many of the Druze fled to northeast Syria for protection, while Israel provided defense for them, and thankfully a degree of protection that Israel could do from that location. But the Kurds in the north are far away from any kind of protection that Israel might consider offering were it able to. And certainly, even though they're in the umbra of the US presence in Erbil, nobody was willing to protect them. Similarly, before the Druze were massacred, again by al Sharaa's troops, in Latakia, the Alawites were also collectively punished. Whether or not they were Assad supporters, innocent people were murdered and the world did not react. And in those videos where they murdered the Druze that you and I have seen, I've met the Druze community in the north of Israel, at Majd al-Shams, who were rent apart by that genocide after the suffering they've had in the war following October 7th. The Alawites also fled to northeast Syria. So now you have a region that was secure for minorities because of Muslims' amazing leadership that has been entirely imperiled. And a charitable remark might be, well, Ahmed al Sharaa doesn't have complete, full control over all of his troops. So that would be the most charitable description. I am a little bit more cynical than that. I think there has been an agreement made between Turkey and Syria. I don't know how that agreement could have been made without the knowledge of the United States, to do whatever it takes to centralize power, which myself and other experts and very important commanders It's not an exaggeration to say that General Mazloum Abdi was the single most important military commander in Syria. We're trying to warn that this could develop and instead promoting the concept of federalization. Even the Iraqi Kurdish leadership was very much in favor of a stable Syria with robust representation for minorities that could then interact with Damascus. That seems to have gone out of the window. And as an
Mhm.
American citizen, I'm asking myself, is this the Trump administration's policy in order to jeopardize all of these minorities and reignite a war that we've already waged against ISIS? And so we are very anxiously awaiting a response from the State Department and from the president about this disgrace.
I think that, many North Americans and Europeans too, but more so North America, I believe, are unaware that they have been the most steadfast allies to the United States and to the West throughout the battle with ISIS and other jihadists in that region. When ISIS was considered to have been defeated, it was the Kurds who were left, as you mentioned, to set up, to manage, to oversee, to run these prisons that Western country nationals were in, and the Western countries, Canada, my home country included, refused to take. And that's gone on for years. The Kurds have shouldered an incredible burden. And as you said, it's bewildering to see what the United States seems to be doing, which seems to be handing a free hand to President Erdogan of Turkey to do with the Kurds as he chooses.
You've said it very well, and few understand the threat of Turkey better than Israel. And so while it was devastating that the Druze faced a true genocide, I think that was in July 2025, and Israel was forced to respond. And actually, Israel was in a very challenging position because many of the Druze serve in the IDF, and they actually wanted maybe a ground offensive or perhaps much more than Israel was really able to do. Because Israel took a robust stance and actually struck in Damascus, I think assets linked to or actual assets of the Ministry of Defense, not only decimating some air bases, disabling some runways, that actually was the key reason why Turkey did not reach Damascus. Make no mistake, Turkey had every intention of reaching Damascus. It was looking at what is known at the Palmyra bases and the T4 bases. It wasn't looking at them for entertainment. It was looking at them to host drone operations and other aerial operations against anything that it perceives a threat, which could, of course, imperil the state of Israel. So now, because Israel defended the Druze and the world did not object to that defense, that has provided a shield to Israel from Turkey. And it was also shielding and helping empower the Syrian Democratic Forces, though that was not the intent. Now the veil is off or the mask is off, and Turkey has been given free rein. Now, my hope is, and I have no contact with senior administrations, though I write my columns and speak on television and hope somebody hears me. My deep, deep hope and wish is that this is just because of the naivete and callous disregard of American Ambassador Tom Barak towards not only the Kurdish people, but all of the minorities across Rojava. And there are over 2 million people that live in that area. I believe within the State Department, there's a huge division over this policy, and there are many officials that are absolutely opposed to this kind of free rein for Turkish foreign policy. But that is my speculation. And the concern is, why does this matter to the average American that's now concerned about affordability, and we're worried about the midterms, and we've got the Greenland and all these things that we're worried about Iran. We've just managed this intervention in Venezuela. Why should they worry about this? Because this destabilization could not only pit Syria into instability and clearly enormous bloodshed, but it can become a launching pad for jihadist terrorism. Somebody said to me the other day at a actually at a Shabbat dinner here in New York with very respected members of the Jewish community. And they said, well, you know, Assad was a monster. And I said, I understand that, but we have to see, unlike Assad, who was a pariah for decades on the world stage,
Right.
Ahmed al Sharaa is received in every capital, has integrated with the international economy, is essentially diplomatically unassailable, and the one military force that could have provided healthy tension to protect the minorities has just been stripped of its authority and is losing men and women as we speak. It is an atrocity.
Kanta, I know that you are in direct contact with people on the ground, Kurds on the ground, and that you have been in recent days. Can you please tell us what you're hearing from them?
So they are telling me how terrified they are. This includes some of the officials, not soldiers, but other officials that I met when I visited. They are foreseeing the release of large numbers of ISIS extremists. And like any person, they're running home to their families to protect their children. They're leaving their homes. They're trying to move further away. With the Yazidi community, those that can are actually wanting to cross the border into Iraq and go back to Mount Sinjar and to the Sinjar area, which is where the ISIS genocide began. The horror show is that there are more ISIS operatives that are potentially uncontained in some of these more remote areas. And so this will cause a humanitarian crisis, a migration crisis, and maybe be a gift to extremists who are laying in wait for them. Others have reported to me, speaking to the Yazidi networks, many individuals are very afraid to mention their names, certainly in the international media, because the extremists are watching this media as well, that in the area of Afrin, isolated Yazidi families are being subject to jizya, poll taxes, to the tune of $2,000 per head of family member. These are extremely impoverished families, but that's extortion out of organized crime in a population that is stuck between an ISIS or let's leave the name ISIS out, an Islamist extremist with full sanction of the Syrian National Army and the international community, and Turkey that is rabidly opposed to people of Kurdish identity or these minorities. The other thing to mention that the international community failed to provide the Syrian Democratic Forces was any aerial cover. Turkey has aerial dominance in that area. With its aerial drone surveillances, the Syrian Democratic Forces completely exposed. Unlike in Iraqi Kurdistan, where President George Bush made the historic no-fly zone, which led to the safeguarding of human life. That was not provided in northeast Syria, and that is a tragedy.
What do you think is going on at the State Department and in the White House? Is this just kind of an issue that's kind of getting lost in the morass of issues that's overwhelming the White House these days, or is this by design?
Gosh, what a great question, Vivian. I would have no way of answering that. And the fact that we have to ask those questions itself is very disturbing.
Yes,
I
it is.
have an enormous amount of confidence in Marco Rubio. Few diplomats understand extremism. He and I strongly believe the moves that the United States took to repatriate criminal Maduro, illegitimate leader of Venezuela, was actually the first step in weakening and further isolating Iran. It is very important to disengage the nexus of Islamist extremism with narco-terrorism, and much of that was with a foothold in Venezuela, not only the oil markets that were fueling Iran's terror economy. So I have no doubt that Secretary of State Marco Rubio would be very aligned with what we're saying. But I am not certain how President Erdogan, like other Muslim brother patrons, has secured so much influence over US foreign policy. It really beggars belief. And
Well, yeah, I would add Qatar to that to that list as well.
That is what I was referring to. Exactly. Exactly. So this is diabolical. The other thing I'm concerned about is relative silence from the capital of the Kurdish regional government, though they have published some statements. They are very concerned and they're feverishly working the diplomatic channels. But they are also in a very difficult position because they are not, in control of the decisions of Baghdad. And so I think what needs to happen is ordinary citizens everywhere, diplomats, we have to elevate the voices and the claims, not only those reports that I described to you, but they're also sending me individual videos. Some of them are really devastating. And tragically, these videos are coming my way. They are absolutely horrendous. The execution of Kurdish female soldiers in uniform at point blank with gunpoint, the desecration of their bodies. I just shared a video with our group, and it actually, the execution was terrible. The desecration of the body was even worse, in which a jubilant jihadist stamps with his muddied boot all over the deceased face. And to me, it's almost impossible to even talk about these things. I'll never be able to unsee that image. Others are coming where organs have been removed, bodies have been enucleated. I don't know whether they were alive or whether they were dead. These extremists are capable of anything. They are not any different than the ideology that had animated and motivated Hamas. It's so tragic and it was so predictable.
We will now show the disturbing video which Dr. Ahmed refers to, because I feel it is the responsibility of those of us who are free and have a voice to inform ourselves and do everything possible to ensure that the world knows that we know. It really is the least we can do. Having said that, we all have our boundaries, and if you choose not to see the video, then you may skip ahead for the next 40 seconds or look away.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر خو 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 طق طق خو طق أنا طق 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 ارمي ارمي ما يا أخوهم كله عدو خلينا نطلع يلا يلا.
Now to come back to what you said about the negotiations and the impression that the Syrian government is trying to portray that we would like to include the Syrian Democratic Forces. This was a negotiation, a March 10th agreement that had been going on for a year, but with many unspecified tenets, just because it was such a point of contention between the two opposing elements. The Syrian Democratic Forces appropriately needed to remain in their battalions with their command structure. For instance, they were the only military with a female command. It is untenable to imagine that they would lay down their uniforms and weapons and integrate with ranks of extremists who do what we imagined and what we have now seen to women warriors. So we knew that that couldn't happen. Also, the Syrian Kurdish forces are much more pluralist, rather like the Israeli forces, with minorities of different backgrounds and different beliefs. And so they had less conflict within their ranks. Now to separate them out and isolate them in groups of extremists was also not tenable. That has been totally disregarded. There was also an agreement that the United States apparently stated, though I need to be checked on this because I haven't been able to read all of the material, that the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, would have political autonomy and autonomy over Kurdish dominant areas. And we've seen that lost today. So much of what was even lip service has not come to pass. And now to state that al Sharaa is saying, well, we welcome you into the national fold and national military is such dishonesty. Whether someone will challenge him on it, we have to wait and see. And the last thing I think we should say is many Kurdish people have written to me about their loyalty and devotion towards Israel, and they were expecting intervention in order to safeguard. And of course, I am not an Israeli citizen. I am not a member of the Israeli diplomatic corps or the military. But one can imagine that there must have been indirect communication between Israel when helping the Druze with notifying the Syrian Democratic Forces about that mission. Now that Israel has stepped to one side, and I do understand Israel has very sensitive and very delicate, tense politics with Turkey. Not only that, but also geographically far away, this has shocked the Kurdish people that Israel has not come to their defense. And at a time when Israel has been so maligned the world over unfairly, to be silent at the plight of these minorities is really irksome. I don't want any nefarious entity, let's say the Iranian so-called Islamic, and I say that as a Muslim, I like to call it the Iranian Islamist Republic, ridiculing the Kurds for ever anticipating the West and Israel could have been loyal allies. That is the danger of this kind of abandonment.
Unfortunately, there are many Iranians within the Islamic Republic, too, who are deeply disappointed that Israel has not done something, that Israel has not intervened. And we won't get into that now because that's one heck of a long discussion. But it's a very, very thorny, complex environment for Israel. And I think I can state confidently that the vast majority of Israelis would like to be able to intervene to end what is happening in Iran. And I think the awareness of what's going on with the Turks is probably not as high, as strong, but they would feel the same way. But I hear what you're saying, and it's unfortunate. And I want to just close, if you don't mind, by asking you this. It strikes me that there's so much going on, and the world has been so distracted by the uprising, this kind of nascent revolution, as I like to think of it, in Iran. And it presented a perfect opportunity for Turkey and al Sharaa to do what they're doing with the Kurds. As you mentioned, it began on January 6th. We are now exactly 2 weeks later. And all eyes are on Tehran, on Iran. Do you think that that's part of the problem here as well, or a factor in the world's just not paying attention?
Well, if I was planning that operation, that would have been a major consideration. I would
Yeah.
say yes, but I also think our world in general is becoming increasingly insular,
Yes.
increasingly oriented towards national security or perceived national security concerns. It is extremely driven by the competition for resources, energy, minerals, and um, in no way do I wish to pontificate, but the rights of the vulnerable, the rights of the weak, the rights of the persecuted are far too low on the list. And it makes it a very sad time. I have very high regard for my adopted country, the United States. I'm so blessed that I became an American citizen. It really was founded on ideals. I regard the office of the president as the most extraordinary office with high reverence. And I have been very gratified by President Trump's foreign policy decisions from the moment that he took office initially. I am certain that many Americans feel like me and have a strong belief that he will intervene on the side of justice and the side of morality. Iran is more complicated. I believe there is a particular timing for that. And I think any intervention from the United States or from Israel or from both is not going to lead to the collapse of the regime. But the Iranian people do deserve the IRGC to take a serious hit for their brutality. We're now at hundreds of thousands of people injured, tens of thousands murdered, who knows how many disappeared. That cannot go unpunished in the world's eye in this digital age. I also think we have to think back to really how isolated Israel was after October 7th and how it fought an extraordinary war of defense on numerous fronts. Most of the fronts I have visited, except, let's say, towards the Houthis. I've seen all the other fronts of that war. And Israel had to do it very much alone. Of course, there is US assistance, but Israel waged that war alone. And so maybe we're entering into a world where if somebody is a minority, the only way they're surviving is if they are a heavily militarized and supported minority. We are no longer able to guarantee the safety and security of our minorities, as we are seeing in the United States, where we're having executions of Jews in our nation's capital, where we are having other atrocities against Jews every day. Look at the devastating events in Australia. We've had mass shootings at the Manchester synagogue. I think that democracy itself is failing because we define it as protecting the rights of the most vulnerable and the most disenfranchised. And if we can't defend the Yazidis who have barely escaped genocide with the help of a coalition of over 84 countries, and now we leave them abandoned, then our own moral fiber is very much in question.
On that unfortunate and slightly despairing note, Dr. Kanta Ahmed, thank you so much for your insight, your time, and for doing the extraordinary work that you do quietly. I will do everything I can on my platform to highlight this horrific, ongoing massacre. And I do hope that when you're next in Israel, we have an opportunity to meet in person.
Vivian, thank you so much for sharing your platform and your audience.
Thank you. Before moving on to our next interview, I will show a short news report that will be more meaningful now that you've heard from Kanta Ahmed. I'm reluctant to use a report from Al Jazeera, which it really is the propaganda arm of the Qatari government, masquerading as a legitimate media outlet. But the reality is that wherever Islamists control territory, Al Jazeera typically is the only media allowed in. We've seen this in the Gaza Strip. Most recently, this occurred during the protests in Iran. Al Jazeera was on the ground. No one else from the West was. And now in Syria, this report that you're about to see was made several days ago, and it explains reasonably accurately what is transpiring on the ground at Al-Hol camp in Syria, now that the Syrian army, basically an Islamist military force, has taken control of the camp from the SDF.
As Syria's army marches further across this country's northeast, taking territory from the Kurdish-backed SDF, the weight of responsibilities it takes on gets heavier. And this could be one of the most challenging. A sprawling prison camp holding wives and children and their husbands swept up in the fight to defeat ISIL. For 7 years, they've been held by the SDF in limbo.
Our children were young and grew up here. We were afraid for the girls and boys because of the SDF and the regime. We've developed psychological problems. There is no education for the girls or boys, no rights whatsoever. We were here unable to say anything, unable to raise a voice.
There are 24,000 people in this camp, more than half are Syrian. There are 6,300 foreign women and children. It's squalid. Disease spreads quickly. This is a desperate place, and there are clearly people here who shouldn't be here, most obviously children. And there is now enormous expectation amongst the people here that now the Syrian government is fully in charge, there'll be some sort of quick resolution to their circumstances and they could quickly be out of here. But it might not be as easy as that. The administration in Damascus will be under pressure from foreign governments to show that it's only releasing people who pose no threat.
When the regime fell, we weren't as happy as we are now, but we want our joy to be complete and for us to go back to our families. We haven't seen them for about 15 years.
After being displaced.
Next, we will hear from Ateret Shmuel. Jerusalem-based, Ateret has been working with indigenous ethnic minorities in the Middle East and elsewhere for decades, and she shares some fascinating insight regarding the commonalities between Kurds and Jews in terms of liberalism, strong identity, and sadly, persecution. Ataret is in constant contact with Kurds in Syria and elsewhere, and she shares with us very current testimonies and information that she has received from her contacts. Thursday, January 22nd, about 6:15 in Israel, where we both are, you in Jerusalem, me somewhere in the south. Ataret Shmuel, thank you so much for making time today to speak with State of Tel Aviv and beyond.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. You have such an interesting background, but we're not going to be able to get into all of it today. We're going to be focusing, of course, on the current, I don't know what to call it, horror, massacre.
Dumpster fire.
That's another way of putting it, involving the Kurds, of course, in the Middle East. So let's start, Ataret. Introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners. Who are you? And how did you become, over years, so involved with the Kurdish people, their cause, their fight?
So I'm an international human and indigenous rights advocate. I have two careers, one in the arts and one in international human rights. I'm also a political advisor on intertribal diplomatic relations and affairs, and the founder and CEO of Indigenous Bridges, which is an international indigenous rights organization. I've been working with Iranian political dissidents since 2003, about, and some of whom were Kurdish. And I've become more and more involved in Kurdish human rights issues and bids for statehood, and basically a lot of the issues that the Kurds face over the last few years, in part because they're the only other groups of people in this region who face literally exactly the same things we do. The truth is that all of the indigenous minority groups of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa all face the exact same heinous, genocidal, colonialist brutality at the hands of the exact same people. But the Kurds are one of the largest tribal groups of the region. And they also their society is like compatible with Western and Jewish values also. They're egalitarian and democratic. And they also are very militarized. The Kurds are known as warriors. And they, along with us, have been on the vanguard of sort of like the last line of defense, protecting not just the Middle East, but also the entirety of the world from radical Islamist colonialist terror. And because they have similar values and similar ideologies, and are also attacked in the same way and also resist in the same way, I have found that there is a lot of interfacing that happens between Kurds and Jews. And I actually genuinely believe that the relationship between Kurds and Jews is critical in whatever direction the world takes geopolitically. I really believe that we can completely change and shift the geopolitical landscape simply based on the relationship between Kurds and Iranians, and also Kurds and between Jews and Iranians and Jews and Kurds. I think that those are the major foundational relationships of this region that really have the potential to reshape and change everything for the better. Basically, is an Al Qaeda and ISIS commander. Even in his little suit with his beard trim, he is still an ISIS and Qaeda commander. And the fact that any leaders in the Western world are even entertaining the prospect of him being reformed or anything other than an Al Qaeda and ISIS commander is frankly laughable and ridiculous. And he's always been very clear about his intentions. He's a jihadist and a genocidal Islamist colonialist terrorist. From the moment he seized power, which he did with a ragtag army of ISIS, Al Qaeda fighters, as well as Dagestani and Chechnyan rebels and other Islamist extremists from all over the world. And the minute he seized power in Syria, began this campaign of genociding all of the indigenous minority groups, starting with the Alawites, then moving on to the Druze, then moving on to the Assyrians and the Christians, and also the Kurds at that point as well. The Kurds were being killed during the Druze massacre and also during the Christian massacre. And now he's focusing his full attention on the Kurds. And it is an absolute bloodbath. There are human rights atrocities galore being committed right now. Sexual crimes against women, children, elderly, slaughtering of entire families, entire villages, kidnapping, sexual trafficking, human trafficking. It is a massacre. It is a genocide taking place. And the fact of the matter is that the world is turning a blind eye to it, despite the fact that what happens in Rojava, what happens to the Kurds with Jolani's army and the Turkish army will affect absolutely every single one of us. It is not going to stop with them. This is just the beginning. And
Right.
the Kurds really, as I said before, are the last line of defense. The Kurds and the Israelis and the Jews and the Druze are really the last line of defense. They're what's protecting the sort of the dam, holding back like the flood of genocidal Islamist colonialism and terrorism into the world. And so if the Kurds are sacrificed in order for President Trump to make business deals with Turkey, who also has similar intentions, despite being a lot more capable of interacting diplomatically with Europe and the West, then the whole world, but especially the Western world and especially Israel, is being damned to having to face the full, like, heinous violence of ISIS. What just happened right now, the Kurds were who defeated ISIS in 2014 after the genocide against the Yazidi, who are now also facing genocide, by the way. And it was the Kurdish women fighters that actually defeated them, who I draw a lot of inspiration from. And they had imprisoned thousands of ISIS terrorists. And just now, Al Jolani's Syrian army released them. So we now have some of the most vile war criminals who have committed some of the worst human rights atrocities known to man, just roaming free beheading people. And if they think for a second, if the Western world thinks for a second that this can be contained to just that one region, they are sorely mistaken. That is coming for all of us as quickly as possible. What is happening right now, like on the ground with the Kurds, is that it is just an extermination campaign. It is an extermination campaign against one of the most important minority groups in the region. The safety and the sovereignty and protection of the Kurds is critical to the stability of not just the Middle East, but the entire region, and not just the entire region, but the entire world. And if we allow them to just be slaughtered, then we're all in danger.
Right. They're a bulwark, they're a buffer. They're also, unlike the Jews, far less is known slash understood in the West about the Kurds. But as you say, right now, and right now being the last few weeks, there's just this really slaughter and genocide, and it's not stopping.
Western secular leaders think that if they throw enough money at Islamist terrorist organizations who are driven by ideology and religion, that they can give them a financial incentive. They can make it beneficial enough for them not to be Islamist terrorists. Now, that it has never once proven successful. And yet, for some reason, there's this inability to admit that and to recognize that. But every single time they've done this, which is numerous times, it's never ended well. It's only ended up with Islamist terrorist organizations who then have a lot more money with which to buy a lot more weapons and commit more atrocities, which they do. And that's what we've seen with Al Qaeda. That's what we've seen with Hamas. That's what we've seen with the Houthis. That's what we've seen this so many times. And Hezbollah. And it's also happening now with ISIS and Al Sharaa. And
Right.
the fact of the matter is that as long as we have people who are making decisions without understanding that there are different cultural lenses and paradigms, they're going to keep making horrible mistakes that result in the death of countless innocent people. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And yet, there's such a deep desire on behalf of the Western world to try and relate to Giuliani as if he's one of them, even though he's very clearly not. And so we have this like massive like clash of cultures taking place. And unfortunately, the fallout of that is ethnic cleansing and massacres all over the place. And the longer that the West and the Western leaders that continue to make these stupid decisions are not able to admit that they're wrong and are not able to admit that this isn't the right way to go about things and are not able to correct their behavior and their actions and their decisions and their treaties with people, the more death and destruction there's going to be. And it's not going to stop. It's not going to be contained at all to Syria. It's going to spread throughout Europe, and as it already is, and the West. And it's only a matter of time until it reaches the United States. It's already there. It's really already there.
What are your friends, your Kurdish friends and contacts with whom you're speaking? What are they saying to you? What's the message they want to get out?
They're
What-
devastated. They're absolutely devastated. One of the things that I love the most about the Kurds is that they speak truth plainly and they experience reality in this plain truth kind of way. They're not manipulative. They just are like, they see things how it is and they call it how it is. And the world owes a major debt to the Kurds. The Kurds really have sacrificed their own lives for decades, for generations, without recognition, without statehood, without support, to protect all of us. And how do we repay that? By continuing to throw them under the bus. So the overwhelming sentiment that I'm getting from Kurds day in and day out is this deep sense of betrayal. They feel betrayed. And because they were betrayed by the United States, they also feel betrayed by Israel, even though we didn't have any part of that. They don't there's like a lack of understanding about the fragile position of Israel in the world, in the perception of most people in the world, but the Kurds are no different.
Tara, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, and keep fighting the good fight.
If I could just say one more thing, I think it's really important that the world understands that all of the indigenous groups in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, we all face the exact same brutality at the hands of the same people. And that all of our fates are interconnected and interwoven. And we actually really we should all be talking about the Kurds right now.
I agree. And you've made that point very emphatically. Thanks so much. Professor Jan Kuzari is based in Stuttgart, an academic, and he works extensively with Kurds in the Middle East. He's a psychotrauma specialist, and in fact, he led a group of professionals who brought approximately 1,000 Yazidi women who had been brutalized by ISIS to Germany for treatment. My discussion with Jan Kuzari was long and fascinating, but for today, I'm editing somewhat ruthlessly to maintain the focus on the crisis of this moment. Dr. Kuzari has been immersed in the ongoing trauma of his people and other persecuted minorities in the Middle East throughout his career. When he speaks, there is an urgency melded with an intense pain, and it comes through in this very controlled, mild-mannered. He speaks of the assimilation of the Kurds in this podcast, particularly in Turkey, which he describes as being a national policy to just assimilate them so that they disappear. But he also says that this policy, this kind of slow disappearance, reinforces the determination of the Kurds. We talk about what's going on the ground and how if this mistreatment of Kurds continues, his concern is that they will probably become more radicalized because they will have to do that in order to survive. But they will not, he assures, they will not give up. Kuzari and I also spent quite a bit of time talking about the increasing and spreading radicalization in much of the Middle East, but focusing, again, our discussion on Turkey and Syria. Our conversation meandered into a discussion of what I'll call the Middle Eastern mentality / paradigm, where power is the language that is understood, that speaks, and that's military power, might, force. And Dr. Kuzari expressed deep concern over the fact that European nations, including Germany, where he is a citizen and lives, that the Europeans have let their military capability wither to the point that they are unable to even protect Ukraine in a meaningful way. And this weakness, he says, is seen by Middle Eastern Islamists, by President Erdogan of Turkey, for example, It is seen as not just being military weakness, but a lack of ideology, conviction. And to them, that just makes nothing. What's there? I've offered a small part of our interview in this podcast in the interest of time and ensuring that I keep your attention. Jan Kazari's first-person plea on behalf of the Kurds in Turkey, Syria, and elsewhere is poignant and striking. Friday, January 23rd. It's about 20 to 5 in the afternoon on Friday, and it's been a beautiful Friday here in southern Israel. Jan Kazilhan, speaking to me from Stuttgart, Germany. Thank you so much for making time to speak with State of Tel Aviv and beyond today.
Thank you to have me with you. It's my pleasure.
It's been quite a week for the Kurdish people, and I know that you are Kurdish and Yazidi, which is quite a lot to be shouldering and living with in this day and age. What I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is to just take a moment and explain to our viewers and listeners who you are and what you do for your life's work, the focus of your scholarship.
I'm a psychology professor at the university in Stuttgart in Germany. My special area are psychotraumatology, and I'm working in post-conflict areas. So we are interested to know what has happened after a trauma or after a war, what will happen mentally when a case of mental health with people. In Turkey, the last 100 years, it was not allowed to speak Kurdish, my mother tongue. Even I know people that were arrested for 10 years in jail just for speaking or writing in Kurdish.
Amazing.
This is the reality. Hundreds of people were executed, killed, or displacement just for being a Kurdish identity. But in another way, and I'm a psychologist and psychotraumatologist, this makes them stronger and not weaker in their identity. And this is the reason why also you, Vivian, you mentioned, we have no difference between men and women, male and female. We always historically fight together against our enemies.
Right.
This was the only way to survive. So there's no differences. And the most heroes of Kurdish fighters against the ISIS in Syria were the Kurdish fighters. And the last 10 years in fighting against the IS, more than 15,000 Kurds lost their lives. Turkey are really a nationalist Islamic organization and ideology. They don't want to accept any another ethnicity. And they did this in the last 100 years. You can be a Turk, but you can never be a Kurd in Turkey. So they try to, it's a kind of assimilation very openly. About half of the Kurds in Turkey, they don't speak any more Kurdish because there are no schools. They can just learn by the parents, but with the time, it's not allowed. So most of the people forget their own languages. If you forget your own language, your culture, and your identity, many of the Kurds believe they are Turks because they don't know anymore they are historically have a Kurdish ancestors. So there is a very clear assimilation in Turkey through different kind of strategies, through the media, through the politics, through the pressure. But Kurds in Rojava are very proud people. As they say, we are Kurds, we are speaking Kurdish, and we want to have our identity. The Kurds in Rojava don't want to overcome Syria. They say, this is a small area where Kurds live, about 2.5 million, just left us to be really honest and integrated in Syria, but in a democratic Syria, with the rights of all minorities. This is so normal. So sometimes in the perspective of Europe, when I'm living in Europe, I'm growing in a democracy countries. Everyone can say openly what they think. Nobody asks me if I'm a Kurd, if I'm a Yazidi. It's just, even my students just heard from the media or my interviews, oh, you're a Kurd. I didn't know because nobody's interested. But in Turkey and Syria, it's different. So the Kurds must fight for surviving. And the Kurds get now more international support by Kurds worldwide. Every day people are on the streets, they are fighting. There are more awards. Kurdish have a new self-definition of identity. They are more educated, high educated, worldwide in different kind of position. And this, our struggle will continue, and we will support our people in Rojava with all possible democratic ways that we have.
Jan, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights and expertise. And I may well turn to you again in the near future to get some updates from you with respect to what is or isn't going on. I certainly hope that
It will be my pleasure.
I certainly hope that the plight of the Kurds in Syria, Turkey, and throughout the Middle East improves, because it can't get worse, and that would just be unthinkable.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's always worth to fight for freedom. Always.
I hear you.
Thank you.
I can think of no more appropriate way to conclude this segment of the podcast than with another clip from a video celebrating the Kurdish resolve and pride in their nation.
The Women's Protection Units, known as YPJ, issued a statement accusing Damascus-linked forces of targeting female fighters during their offensive in northeast Syria. The group warned that factions have committed despicable acts against the bodies of Kurdish female fighters.
Our braided hair has become a source of terror in the hearts of our enemies, because victory will inevitably belong to women and freedom-loving peoples.
The Congress Star, women's movement in Rojava, responded to the incident, stating that cutting braids will not break the will of Kurdish women fighters.
My braids are my dignity, and cutting them will not break my will. Dignity cannot be cut, and the resistance continues.
The Syrian government has moved to expand control into areas long administered by the SDF, Washington's main partner in the fight against Islamic State. In recent days, Syrian forces have taken key detention sites near Raqqa. Kurdish media report the anger spreading under slogans such as, "In place of one braid, millions will grow," framing the incident as an attack on women fighters. The identity of the woman in the video could not be independently verified. The YPJ called on women across Kurdistan to join what it described as a mobilization in the spirit of Kobani, the Syrian town where Kurdish forces resisted the Islamic State.
Our final guest today is Ahmed al Sharaa. He was raised in Jordan, and he's a research fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based FDD. He shares the view that the Kurds have been betrayed and are in an impossible spot at the moment. But he's slightly more optimistic about the possibility of President al Sharaa evolving into a more responsible leader. He sees him as a pragmatist, perhaps something of an evolving Islamist. Sharaa offers a slightly different perspective from the others, and one that is important to hear. Ahmed Sharaa has deep contacts and ties with Middle Eastern Kurds. His focus, however, in this short interview is more on the potential of al Sharaa to manage the extremists in his government and military, and to forge, over time, a more stable national infrastructure. Nation building is not for the faint of heart or the impatient. In this discussion, we focus on the recent massacres of the Druze and the Kurds in Syria, the lack of discipline in the Syrian army, again, which is comprised of a significant cohort of jihadists, including ISIS fighters. And we get into why the United States has thrown its support behind al Sharaa, and in the eyes of many, betrayed its longtime ally, the SDF, the Kurdish army, which has been a loyal, effective, and staunch U.S. ally for more than a decade, and without which ISIS would likely still be ruling northern Syria, and perhaps more territory. Monday, January 26th, it's about 5:30 in the evening in Israel, where I am, making it 10:30 in the morning, where you are, Ahmed Sharaa, senior researcher with the FDD in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you for having me.
We've been discussing your work, which for several years now has been focused on Syria, the Levant broadly, but in particular, since the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, you have spent significant time studying and paying attention to the treatment of minorities in Syria under the al Sharaa government. Tell us just broadly what you've observed since he came to power.
Of course, since December 2024, with the fall of the Assad regime, Ahmed al Sharaa, or was called Abu Muhammad al Juran, his nom de guerre when he led Al Qaeda in Syria. A lot of Syria's ethnic minorities were concerned about his rise, about the fear that this Islamist will bring Sharia law and will oppress Syria's ethnic minorities. And unfortunately, we saw images of, that these concerns materialized in two sectarian massacres, one against the Alawites in the western coast of Syria, and one against the Druze in the south back in July. And so he does not have the best track record when dealing with minorities. And it appears that the Kurds, in this case in northeast Syria, one of the biggest ethnic minorities in Syria, are also concerned about the recent military campaign that might target their areas if a ceasefire that is currently in place is to collapse, and it is likely to collapse. And so it does not strike me with confidence that minorities will be treated well in the short term in Syria, mainly because, again, over the past year, we saw 2 sectarian massacres. I think that's a record for any country that is coming out of a civil war or revolution. And there needs to be more protections and more guarantees for these communities in order to build trust and for them to at least create some sort of stability in Syria.
Just heard earlier today, I'm pretty sure, that the ceasefire has been extended by another 2 weeks. Did I get that right?
Yes.
And it's been in place for, I think, close to a week at this point. What we do know is that in the weeks preceding the ceasefire, there was a slaughter and very significant battles with the SDF, between the SDF and what in effect is the Syrian army, the al Sharaa forces. The ceasefire is in place now. You're not giving it a high chance of continuing. Why is that?
Ever since the ceasefire was put in place, there's been daily clashes between both sides, shelling of towns, shootings, and drones striking each other's positions. The issue here is the ceasefire is being connected to the transfer of ISIS prisoners from some of these camps to Iraq, and that is being led by the U.S. So what I assess is that when the U.S. is finished with that plan, and that's transferring these about 7,000 prisoners, the fighting will likely continue. And that's essentially because both sides can't agree on a long-term solution to this issue. And that's integration and giving Kurds their political and linguistic and cultural rights. The Sharaa government wants the Kurds to integrate into the state and disarm. The SDF wants to maintain its weapons and some of its autonomy in its Kurdish regions. And that's a major point of disagreement over the past year. And again, because of that disagreement, I'm not confident that this ceasefire will hold after the U.S. finishes transferring the ISIS prisoners.
Why do you think the U.S. has made the decision to allow these ISIS prisoners, thousands, tens of thousands, and their families, to move to Iraq? The Kurds, as you mentioned, sacrificed significant numbers of fighters to contain and defeat ISIS. They were a really important American ally in that battle. And when ISIS was declared to or considered to have been defeated, it was the Kurds who were left holding the bag. They were left alone to deal with these tens of thousands of ISIS fighters and, again, their families who were put in various camps, but the largest number were put in the Al-Hol camp, which is in northern Syria. It's been decided somewhere that these people should all be freed and allowed to go to Iraq. Many of them are foreign nationals. And the Americans are facilitating this. The Kurds are saying this is a huge betrayal. We sacrificed so much. We supported you. You supported us. And now, America, you're allowing them to just escape and go? How would you explain the American position? Why are they doing this?
So from what I understand, they will be transferring the ISIS fighters to Iraqi prisons and they won't be released, thankfully. But in terms of understanding the US position here, since President Trump's election, and actually pinpointed to May when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia and did his Gulf tour, we saw a shift in America's stance with the new Syrian government. And that is, it's become more supportive and especially with the sanctions relief, but now we're seeing political and diplomatic support for the Syrian government. Again, the SDF was a counterterrorism partner of the US since 2015. And the US tried to create some sort of stability in Syria by mediating talks between them and the Damascus government, which ultimately collapsed, as I stated earlier. What the US wants is stability in Syria, and stability under one man and under one central government. It chose to side with the state actor and against the non-state actor. And that appears to be a logical explanation of why countries choose to side with one side rather than the other in these cases. But I think the process of how they sided with them was a bit flawed. And I think, especially when it came to the SDF's role as a counterterrorism partner, and with the chaos that ensued with some ISIS prisoners leaving and escaping because of the chaos, I think the US could have handled that better. But again, in terms of diplomacy and negotiations, I think the US took a balanced approach initially, but it appears that it either got fed up with the SDF's rejection of integration, or at least stalling of the integration agreement, and decided to take Damascus' side. But again, I think the critical point here is the mishandling of the ISIS prisoners. And I think the US and the broader coalition could have done more to prevent some of these escapes when the chaos was happening, whether by telling the Syrian government not to approach these prisons at this moment, or trying to prevent their entry into these prisons. These are small details, but here the main point is the US chose Sharaa and the Damascus government as their, I would say, that's their primary choice in Syria, but they could have handled things better when it came to dealing with the SDF as a counterterrorism partner.
And the American ambassador to Turkey last week put out on social media a lengthy statement, and a very bold statement, in which he said pretty much what you've just said. We are standing with al Sharaa. We believe that Syria has to succeed. We support the success of the Syrian state. And you Kurds, it's time to lay down arms and take up citizenship and loyalty to this state, to the state of Syria, which is where you live. And at the same time, you have al Sharaa's forces slaughtering Kurds. It's surreal, is it not?
Absolutely. And I've heard, but I'm not sure if this is confirmed, that during the negotiations between the SDF and Damascus recently, when Sharaa asked the Kurds or the SDF to integrate, the leader of the SDF, Mazloum Abdi, said, how can we integrate into an army that killed our soldiers and threw them from buildings?
I include here a very short and graphic video, which was sent to me by Ahmed al Sharaa. This video shows a young female Kurdish soldier being thrown to her death from a roof by Syrian soldiers. Again, if you prefer not to see this video, then please look away or fast forward for the next 25 seconds.
تنزيله إلى أنا بشرفها. الحمد لله على السلامة يا شباب.
2 weeks ago, there was footage of Syrian soldiers throwing a fighter, a lady, off a building. And that's the broader issue within Syria as a whole. And that's the lack of trust after all these sectarian massacres. Now people ask the Druze and the Alawites to trust this new government, but how can we trust this new government if it's not holding its own fighters accountable for the crimes they've committed? The same would apply for the Kurds. Now let's say things improve and the Kurds integrate into the state. What guarantees do they have that this state will treat them properly and that they won't be massacred if clashes happen or disagreements happen? There are no guarantees. And again, that's another point that the US should stress: accountability. Because again, 2 massacres, more than 1,000 killed from each side. still no accountability. There was one court hearing, but nothing came out of it. The Syrian army is not, we're still seeing ISIS patches on some of the uniforms. We are still seeing sectarian messages and there's multiple videos of Syrian soldiers saying the most vile things about these communities. Right. So there should be they should look at themselves internally and see how they can improve before they ask others to integrate, to trust them.
You don't have any ideas to how al Sharaa responded when the SDF, the head of the SDF, asked him, "How can we trust you?" Any idea what al Sharaa said in response?
I'm sure, given what I've been following, I think he would have answered the same way he's been answering this whole year, is that these people will be held accountable and that these are individualistic acts and that's not the trajectory of the Syrian state or the Syrian army. But again, actions matter more than words in this case.
Indeed, they do. And again, I can't remind or restate this too often that al Sharaa himself has never renounced his Islamist beliefs, the ideology to which he adhered and fought for so many years, first as an al-Qaeda fighter and then Jabhat al-Nusra. And today he is the president of Syria. And as you quite rightly note, the Syrian army is comprised of some people who still have ISIS patches on their uniforms. I'm sure others have different patches. It was a ragtag kind of coming together when al Sharaa led various forces to topple the Assad government. It was many smaller militias that coalesced at the time in pursuit of a common goal, which was to get rid of Assad. But they are jihadists. Is that a correct statement in your view?
I would say some of them are. I think because there was a process of integration following the fall of the Assad regime, and within Sharaa's own coalition, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, during their offensive, there were no sectarian massacres happening during that campaign to topple Assad. I think Sharaa's biggest issue and Sharaa's army's biggest issue is the lack of discipline and the lack of control he exercises. Now, he may, again, once a jihadist, always a jihadist, understandable, but he's more of a pragmatist than an extremist in my eyes, especially after the past year and a half. The thing is, he has surrounded himself with jihadists and those with radical views. And if we're looking at this from a hierarchical perspective, the lower you go through the chain, the more radical they get. And that's because there's a lack of oversight on these guys. And one example was last month, a member of the Syrian security forces shot 2 American servicemen and a civilian interpreter. And it turned out that this man was a member of the Syrian Ministry of Interior's forces, but had radical or sympathies to radical elements and ISIS. And when the Syrian government were asked if they had more radical jihadists within their own ranks, they said, yes, we identified this guy, but we couldn't fire him because it was during the weekend. So you also see a bit of incompetence in the way they deal with their own security apparatus. So incompetence, radical elements, they're not disciplined, and they don't listen to their leadership. You're going to get sectarian massacres. You're going to get massacres in general. So that's my summary of why these things happen in Syria, why there's still instability, why a stable state cannot be formed in the next few months or in the next few years, because the issues are structural and they need years to be fixed.
Ahmed, thank you so much for taking the time to explain this quagmire. Ahmed, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, for telling us some of the detail that you've been watching, and I look forward to speaking to you down the road. Hopefully we'll see things resolve, but I share your lack of optimism for the near term in terms of Syria turning into a land of unicorns and rainbows, but we'll be definitely keeping a close eye on it at State of Tel Aviv and beyond. Thanks so much. All of the guests that you just heard from agree on the bottom line message. We must not look away. Apathy and ignorance are not options. The Kurdish people have been a steadfast ally of the West, most recently in leading the battle to defeat ISIS. It is clear to all of us that no matter how far away you live from the Middle East, this battle is about protecting the freedoms we have come in the West, in many instances, to take for granted. We think that all this craziness will pass somehow. It'll skip over. Well, no one has the luxury of indulging such thoughts. I usually avoid being preachy, but it seems appropriate and necessary today. In the West, too many are looking away. People's lives are busy. But mostly, I think that things have become so chaotic and messy in the world and dangerous. It's also very challenging to find reliable information sources and takes a lot of work. Speaking up and out publicly comes with risk. But I promise you that if you do not do your bit, you may wake up one day and realize that you missed the opportunity. Thanks, as always, for being here. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. That's VIVIAN @stateoftelaviv.com. And if you go to our website, stateoftelaviv.com, you can find the subscribe button and take it from there. Hope that you do that. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything. Thank you, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team, and thank you, listeners, for being here. Until next time, stay safe.